evening. My name is Kate Elfrink. I have a question for Mr. Attenborough. I watched your movie, and of course, there's no denying this is all extremely intriguing. But the question I have is, how do your passengers get back in their chairs the minute they go from zero gravity back into gravity? Do they then fall out of space or lie on the bottom? That wasn't in the movie, and I find it extremely intriguing.
I don't think anybody's asked me that question before, but it's but it is a good question. And you're obviously going to be heading to the right part of the spacecraft, as you rightly point out, because as gravity comes back in, you're going to be sort of down on the floor. The interior of the spacecraft actually is something that we're developing, and we're developing several versions of it at the moment. The version you saw on the animation, I think, probably won't be what we end up with. I think what's likely to be the case is that we will aim to have a cabin floor, which is possibly made out of the can't remember what it's called, the tempura foam, which so all you will need to do is just to get back onto the floor. And the seats that we have on the way up that will sort of hold you as you're going up to altitude, and then on the rocket burn up to space will be seats which will fold away. And so you will only use them in that time on the way up, and then possibly on the glide down as well. You actually have, I think, about 23 seconds between zero gravity and 1G. So it is a reasonable amount of time, actually, to get people in the right positions. But we have debated this at some length internally, because the Gs on the way down are quite high, and it's important that you are lying down, so the Gs are coming from front to back rather than head to toe. And it's important that if you're lying in a seat, that you're in the seat properly, because you go up to about 6 Gs just briefly. So actually just having people lying on a soft floor is probably the safest way to do that.
Is the rocket itself a single rocket or dual rocket?
It's a single rocket. It's a hybrid rocket motor.
So when you're coming back, are you using the rocket to get back?
No. As soon as you turn the rocket motor off at the end of the boost on the way up, that's the last time you use any power. Gravity brings you down. And as I said, the rate of descent is slowed by those rotated wings, by the feathers. When you rotate the wings back to the aircraft configuration, you've got a carbon fiber glider and a nice half an hour or so of a glide back down on an unpowered landing.
During re-entry, there's so much of resistance from the atmosphere that the heat temperature goes up very high. In the absence of heat shields, don't you have any special treatment on the outer skin of the aircraft?
Well, that's another good question. You'll see if you come and look at the model, there is some very limited thermal protection that is required for this. But there is no special heat shield that is needed. And there are two reasons for this. The first, remember that we're not going into orbit with this spacecraft. So we're coming back into the Earth's atmosphere at roughly the same speed that we went out of it. So we're coming in at about sort of Mach 3.8 maximum. So that's it's fast, but it's quite a lot slower than you'd come back if you were coming in from orbit. But the main reason that we don't need this thermal protection is because the aerodynamic design and the rotated wings, the feathering effect, actually slows the spacecraft in the upper atmosphere to an extent where you never build up excessive heat. So the carbon fiber construction, with the exception of a couple of specific areas, is robust enough to withstand the heat that is built up in that feathered re-entry. And that was something which was just a masterpiece of design, and something which really transformed the levels of safety in what, as you rightly say, is otherwise quite a dangerous point of spaceflight.
Yeah, I want to ask Glenn a question.
Good.
Glenn, you spoke about stem cell research. Now, there have been ethical issues about stem cell research in the United States, where people debate that life starts at conception rather than at birth. And if you're using embryonic stem cells, you are violating life. I don't know if the Indian government has a stand on that position on stem cell research, but why is there so much controversy over here on stem cell research? And what can you do to convince people that stem cell research is good?
Well, I guess, since you're using, you're using live embryos, right, as a source of stem cell, There's always going to be the ethical issue, especially with certain conservative governments, right, in terms of stem cells. I think recently there's been a rampant move towards, there's a lot more acceptance of late in terms of patenting of stem cells and patenting of especially embryonic stem cells as compared to the past. I know in India there are a couple of institutions who have some ongoing efforts in embryonic stem cells. It's still very early days, but some of the work which has been done is extremely exciting in terms of embryonic stem cells. So there is clearly an ethical issue, depends on which way you look at it. If you're ending up saving life, right, and if you're actually able to treat degenerative diseases, right, through stem cells, there is a huge argument for allowing embryonic stem cells to be used going forward.
Over here in front here.
Thank you. My name's Rachna. Thank you very much for the presentations this afternoon. Questions for you, Glenn. The first question is that previously there was a well-recognized arms race. Now there's a recognized drug race, and the need to be first to market and have the best profile in terms of efficacy and safety is paramount to a drug's commercial success. So how do you deal or how do you manage with your development program so that you have the best drug profile? And then I have a second question after that.
Sure. So I think, what we did was at Glenmark, our approach was a little different, right? In the early days, when we did chemical-based research, right, chemistry-based, all our focus was on shortcomings of the 3 drugs in the clinic that were ahead of us. We were able to identify certain shortcomings and use that as a platform for research. So we did that very successfully, and that's the reason we were able to conclude deals with Merck, Lilly, Forest, and Teijin, all 4 majors. I think today, obviously, it's a much more challenging environment. But some of the new targets that are coming up, right, with the Human Genome Project in particular, I mean, there are numerous amounts of new drug targets which are out there. If someone has to actually take them up and conceptually identify and work on them, right, there's a clear opportunity to be first in class. Also, some of the biologic work that we're doing out of Switzerland, I mean, we're completely working on the 2 targets we're working on where we are clearly first in class. They're completely novel, and from there on, it's a race, right, as to who gets there first. But you clearly have a head start in that space.
Thank you. And the second question actually is on biologics. And one of the key issues with developing biologics is the R&D expense. And obviously, it's very expensive to develop a drug commercially. I think it's estimated that a small molecule costs nearly $1 billion to get a blockbuster. So for a biologic, it will cost obviously a lot more. But the issue is really, how does that translate to patients, and how do they pay for the cost of biologic treatment? And how do you see that progressing going forwards?
So I think the strike rate for biologics is far, far better than small molecules, and that's the reason to be doing that. Purely because, by virtue of being a biologic, the human body, since it's something which is generated by the body, it's less likely to reject in terms of toxicity and profile, right? It doesn't go to the liver to get metabolized like a typical chemical entity. So it goes straight into the bloodstream, and it's very well accepted by the human body. So the strike rate is much higher in terms of druggable candidates, right, in the biologic space. I guess in terms of cost of therapy, clearly cost of therapy is high, and you will see the cost of therapy staying high purely because of the manufacturing challenges. So it's a huge challenge to make sufficient large quantities of biologics, and that's a huge challenge globally that most companies are facing in terms of the manufacturing challenges. So that's the reason cost of therapy is high. But also, I mean, if you see biologics today, I mean, you could take 1 injection a month, right? And so it's, because of the long half-life, some of these biological entities, you may need 1 shot a day, right up to 1 shot a year, right? And you'd be fine. So there are significant advantages where you just take 1 shot a month or 1 shot a year, right? And you could be okay in some disease conditions.
But even then, I understand, for example, for Avastin, it costs $50 $1,000 for 10 months' supply, which is the average cost of therapy. So the costs are remarkably high for many patients. So
Sure.
that was where.
Sure, I think it's a huge challenge, but the efficacy is far, far better than what you could get. So I think it all boils down to survival rates and those aspects, right? If you're able, in a case, in a cancer patient, if you're able to extend out life for a couple of years, it's pretty significant, right? And that class of patients don't mind the incremental cost. So it's a fine line, but clearly the biological therapy is here to stay in the long run.
Thank you, Glenn.
Ken Onsraj from New York. I have a question on regulation and how do you essentially self-regulate with international standards?
Are you referring to at Glenmark or?
At Glenmark, yeah.
I mean, I think today the game is completely global, right? I mean, if your end game is to license to a big pharma company, clearly you would have the systems, procedures, the quality checks, and the standards, right, to meet that. So before licensing a molecule, right, a big pharma will go through an extensive due diligence exercise, right, for which they're paying you the large upfront payment. So there's a lot of systems and procedures that one has already built in place and has constantly is constantly building as you go forward.
Here, over in the front.
Does that answer your question, or?
How do you match, for example, FDA standards?
Well, so everything that we do, I mean, so our guiding principles are all as per the FDA. I mean, for a Glenmark per se, right, we file INDs with the FDA, so right in the early stages, right, we start communicating with the agency very early in the process, pretty much like any other company globally, especially in the US or coming out of Europe. So it's pretty much a global game. Today, everybody wants to get to the agency as early as possible to get as much information early in the development process, right, so that you don't put up a lot of capital and then realize you've got a problem. So I think the game is completely global today. You'd get in FDA's comments, you'd get in the thoughts of the agency very early in the process, and then accordingly you'll develop your clinical plan to meet those requirements.
Ajay from Cisco. What I heard that you said 5 minutes of excitement in the space. Can it be more than that?
This, you get a lot more than 5 minutes excitement, but you get the actual time in weightlessness on this flight is about 4 or 5 minutes, and that's determined by the height or the altitude that we fly to, which in turn is determined by the amount of power that's required by the spaceship, and there's a very fine line actually between the amount of time that we give for weightlessness and the g-forces that are involved in the acceleration and the deceleration. So the more weightlessness you get, the higher you've got to go, the faster you've got to go up, and the faster you've got to come down. We think that line is about right, because we've tested our first 100 customers. We've put them all in a centrifuge. It had never been done before. Very wide range of medical histories and conditions, and it looks like the vast majority of people are going to be fine with this flight at that G-force level. If you put the G-forces much higher, then you might have a problem, and the market effectively gets smaller. So I think I always equate it a little bit to Everest. I mean, people spend a similar amount of money preparing and going and climbing Everest. Nobody really ever asks how long you spend on the summit. It's the fact that you've got there and that you've experienced something that very few people have experienced, and the memories obviously last a lifetime. I think the other thing is that you have to remember that this is a first step. I mean, what we're trying to do here is to demonstrate safety and commercial viability of spaceflight for ordinary people. If we can do that, we expect there to be a wall of private sector money which comes into the industry because it suddenly looks attractive. And then you could see things develop really quite quickly, so we could extend to orbital spacecraft which have similar levels of safety and inclusivity as this craft. And then the idea of space hotels and a fortnight in space become a real reality. But we have to get this, we have to get this right first. So a step at a time.
A little technical here.
You said this aircraft is going to be one of the largest aircrafts produced.
The largest carbon composite aircraft, yeah.
Okay, and since it is carbon content, could you just throw some light on what would be the all-up weight with the total configuration?
I couldn't, I'm afraid. It's something that we haven't disclosed publicly as yet. There's a lot of commercial confidentiality in this program still, because what is being developed is very valuable IP. So there are certain things we're prepared to talk about, like the wingspan and the cabin volume and that sort of thing. The weight we haven't disclosed yet, I'm afraid. Okay. But what I can say is actually that it has that aircraft will carry about 25% more weight than is represented by a fully crewed Spaceship Two. So we have over-engineered it specifically because we think that the aircraft itself has a lot of other applications which will require it to lift slightly heavier weights to high altitude.
In relation to the safety,
yeah.
Okay, you don't give the figure of all-up weight or the max takeoff speed, but a simple brand question, what kind of tire are you going to use on the aircraft?
What kind of tire?
Yeah. What brand of tire?
What brand of tire?
Yes.
Yeah. That's another question I've never been asked before.
Virgin tires?
Virgin tires, yes, a new business. You might have seen on Spaceship One, actually, that when it lands, it has a skid on the front rather than tires, and that's going to be the same for Spaceship Two as well. So there'll be normal undercarriage under the wings and then a skid on the nose. But yeah, definitely Virgin tires.
Glenn, for somebody born today who has a healthy diet, who does a lot of exercise, maybe a couple of Virgin Galactica space flights during their lifetime, what is their life expectancy going to be if they could access all of your portfolio of regenerative and biologic drugs?
Sorry, just say...
What is their life expectancy going to be if they could access the full portfolio of your drugs?
Well, I guess, I mean, are you referring to Glenmark per se, or are you referring to my presentation, right? I mean, if you've got stem cell research, right, and if stem cell research actually has to work, right, you could expect a pretty significant increase in the life expectancy, right? I think there are a lot of challenges that still have to be answered as far as stem cell research goes. But clearly the concept and the technology, right, some of the initial papers and findings, right, shows a lot of promise in terms of especially embryonic stem cells, right, and their ability to transform into various cell types. You would see significant increases in life expectancy.
I'm Chandar Uday Singh. I have a question for Glenn Sildana. I think one of the very important new drug discoveries that's been reported in the last few days is that placebos work better than all your discoveries. Is that correct? And the follow-up question is, apparently the more expensive the placebo, the better it works. Now, isn't it better for you to just research salines and how to deliver them?
I think you're asking the wrong guy, right? I'll be out of business if I have to answer that, right? I mean, clearly you have to, I think drug treatment actually works very clearly. I mean, you've got some pretty serious diseases out there, right, which are being treated, and you're seeing clear improvement in survival rates. Cancer is a classic example. I mean, ever since the whole biological entities have been invented, you're seeing significant increase in survival rates of patients. AIDS is another classic example. I mean, today, with AIDS treatments, you've been able to extend life over tens of years, compared to, initially what it was. So drug treatment clearly works. I mean, there's no... Sorry?
Are working better.
I mean, clearly, there are millions of reports that come out every day on healthcare and on medications, right? I mean, even in India, I mean, there's a bunch of newspapers who keep publishing articles on new innovations, and some of them clearly I don't think are accurate at all, actually.
In your most inspiring presentations, you've promised us the space. When do you get us the moon? And on a more serious note, once you're up there in the sky, what do you exactly see? Is it just one part of the Earth, or is it the entire...
Okay. Well, let me answer the second question first, because that's easier. And that is that you don't see the whole globe at that altitude, but you see about 1,000 miles in any direction. So I should have looked up actually before I came what that would mean if you were to fly from Delhi, and I'm not sure what it does, but it's the views that you saw, from both films actually were in the animation we used the views that we took from Spaceship One, and it's pretty much the same view, a little lower, but pretty much the same sort of view that the astronauts from the space station get, as they orbit the Earth. And I think the impressive thing is, from all accounts, that you're sitting in the blackness of space. It's broad daylight, but it's still black. To look back and particularly see the thin layer of atmosphere around the Earth, and the reasonable view of the continents and oceans from wherever you're flying from, is by all accounts a pretty dramatic experience. Richard Branson's talked about getting to the moon, and we don't have any specific plans on that at the moment. But I think that the general point is, as I said before, that space access needs to be transformed in so many ways. We think we have a system here that transforms it extremely well, certainly for suborbital flight. If we do this right, if we keep people safe, if we make money as a commercial venture from it, then I think you'll see or potentially see really rapid developments. I'd love to go to the moon, and I'm sure a lot of other people would as well. So let's keep our fingers crossed.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We truly live in interesting times. Let's make the most of it. Thank you very much.